properly mitigated and approved by the appropriate government entity, then those companies can perform on classified contracts as well. In fact, there's roughly about 150 companies, U.S. companies that are foreign-owned that operate under majority mitigation agreements. Those are known as a special security agreement, a voting trust, or a proxy agreement, including some Japanese companies, which was addressed at the previous panel. Mr. Jelinas mentioned that. There's not a lot of Japanese companies, but there's probably about a half a dozen based on my due diligence. That's not a public record, but I've gathered some statistics over the years. Okay. And so there's 4 cognizant security agencies that have responsible for standing up their industrial security programs: the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Within the DoD, the Defense Security Service is responsible for oversight of cleared industry primarily. Obviously there are other government agencies that have industrial security programs, and they're smaller programs. DSS is actually responsible for 13,000 cleared facilities, including, as I said, there's a small degree of foreign-owned U.S. companies as well. So in addition to DSS sponsoring companies, or I should say reviewing companies that are sponsored for facility clearances and then adjudicating it, and then if everything meets the regulations, they issue clearances. They also have responsibility for conducting reviews of companies. And those reviews are generally done on a yearly basis, sometimes longer, depending on the security posture of the company. With respect to foreign U.S.-owned companies, those reviews are always done on a yearly basis. But it's surprising that many of those companies have outstanding security programs. And one of the key takeaways is that in order to maintain your clearance, you have to have a good security program, because it can be taken away. And there's repercussions, but I'll address those in some slides that are coming up. Now, another important development is that the Defense Security Service is moving away from their standard way of conducting a security review. Currently, it's based on a body of regulations, the National Industrial Security Program Operating Manual. There's hundreds and hundreds of regulations that apply, and that's what the review is based on. However, DSS wants to move away from that method and start conducting reviews on the threat to the specific company's technologies. And DSS wants to work with the companies to identify the threat, and then also identify what the vulnerabilities are, and then come up with some countermeasures as well. So the program has just started, and there's been a couple of pilot programs conducted, and those pilot programs were conducted at a number of companies that operate under special security agreements and proxy agreements. But it's just starting off, and it's going to take a little time for that new methodology to be adopted by DSS and obviously embraced by cleared industry as well. So the key takeaways are, as I said, companies need to comply. It's very, very important. If they don't comply, then there's repercussions, and there's serious repercussions. Number one, a facility clearance could be invalidated. So if your clearance is invalidated, that means you can no longer perform on classified contracts unless the government contracting agency okays it. You also can no longer bid on potential classified contracts. And it can take quite some time to get your clearance reinstated. In fact, it's 90 days or longer. So that's an incentive to definitely stay in compliance if you ask a company that has had their clearance invalidated. And of course, then there's the most serious repercussion would be that the clearance is administratively terminated, which means then the company is out of the classified market. They can no longer perform on classified contracts, and obviously that's a black mark on their record, and it would probably take them quite some time to obtain a facility security clearance in the future. They'd have to do some serious adjustments to get back into the program. So with that, I think that it's very important for the Japanese industry to move forward to establishing an industrial security program within their country, and obviously that it's going to take some time because if you look at the U.S. program, it started in 1951 and it evolved over the years into a very robust program. But it's a step in the right direction, and it will allow the industries to actually exchange classified information between themselves and enter into classified contracts, which I think will be very, very, very beneficial for all in the long term.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a host of questions I wanted to ask you, but tell you what, I want to hear from Steve Ganyard first. Steve is president of, how do you say that? Evison Global Advisors. I see it on the card. I write to the guy in the emails, but I've never pronounced the name of his company. Evison Global Advisors, which is a strategic and management consulting firm serving clients in government-driven industries. He's worked in a number of areas besides the defense area, including unconventional oil and gas. He's co-founder of the China Beige Book, which a lot of us know and use. Thank him for that. He's also previously served as chief of staff to the counselor for the Secretary of State. And in Marine Corps, he served as the military assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, as well as in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And as a fighter pilot, Mr. Ganyard received 2 decorations for combat valor. I guess you're not going to tell us which conflict that was.
World War II.
World War II, yeah. Damn, I was hoping I thought you were going to hold out for World War I. With you and Eddie Reckenbacher going up against the
That's John Glenn's days.
Graduate of Northwestern University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's published articles and opinion pieces in New York Times and elsewhere, and professional journals. I turned that on, didn't I? He's also a member of the Bretton Woods Committee and also serves as consultant to the Institute of Defense Analyses. Steve.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is a tough duty here, being the last guy in the last day. So I'll try to. I'll be a little bit provocative here. My talk will be full of personal opinions. So I hope I don't offend anybody. But I will offer my personal opinions that's based on our commercial practice. I have both Japanese and U.S. clients that we work in Japan. I'm back from Japan just on Friday. So if my voice is a little hoarse, that's why. Along with some colleagues here that are in the room. So let me start out with some thoughts on challenges for the Japanese defense technology development. And most of my comments today will be directed towards or with my Japanese friends in mind, because I think this is really an unequal dialogue. This is Japan is interested in more industrial development, defense industrial development with the United States. There are some reasons why that is good for the alliance, but in terms of incentivizing, which we discussed on the previous panel, incentivizing industry and incentivizing the U.S. to partake or to participate more in that relationship, really the burden for that rests with the Japanese. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Some assumptions and some beliefs on where we stand in the relationship. bluntly, Japanese industry is not cost competitive on defense articles. The problem is that the Ministry of Finance every year tends to craft a budget with the industrial base and jobs in mind, and to ensure that jobs and social stability are the primary factor. So there's never been any competitive discipline to Japanese industry in the way that there have been in many other countries, which means that all of the forcing functions of profit and loss and efficiency have been not sacrificed, but have been put aside for development and maintenance of the Japanese defense industrial base, such as it is. Japan also has few indigenous capabilities and systems that are qualitatively competitive around the world. There are the Soryu submarine is right up there as an example that is globally competitive. Lost a tough competition to the Australians or to the French in Australia, but it's still a great submarine. But other than that, there aren't too many things that international clients are clamoring for that are purely Japanese indigenously capable created. Japanese industry, I think, does not have the effective mechanisms for evaluating and pursuing go-to-market fundamentals for defense exports. Most of these firms, because they wait for an order. So the government tells them what they want them to build, and they either go out under licensed production and do a build to print, or develop something indigenously. But these companies that are terrific companies, say a Hitachi or a Toshiba, which are top 100, top 500 in the world, that have great international business, their defense units have never had to compete, and so you don't find that same competitive DNA within the defense units of some really, really terrific international Japanese companies. Again, a lot of opinion here, but I think that the 3P changes have been in name only. Been following this for several years. I think that Prime Minister Abe had a great idea on changing the 3Ps, and he's got an overarching vision of where he wants to see the government go and the nation go. But I still find that with my Japanese clients and with my U.S. clients that there's a bureaucratic Gordian knot trying to get through defense exports. There's been a lot of push from our friends at METI to create dual-use technologies, which would make the clearance process easier. Dual use, that's nice, but at some point you have to fess up and say, we need a military-only capability, and we've got to be able to figure out how we're going to do that. And if we want to export, we need to figure out how we're going to do that as well. I think that industry lacks an export or co-development incentives outside of government Japan initiatives. So industry itself, if I'm the head of, say, MHI or MC, and I'm the CEO, and I have $1 million yen to spend on some new investment, why would I spend that on something in the defense sector where I know that the government's going to limit me to, say, 4 to 6% profit margin above and beyond my costs, when I could go somewhere else and do something internationally and I can look at 10, 20, 30% margin. So there's a lack of incentive for the Japanese industry as itself, and there's also a risk that the Japanese government has yet to take on to help its industry, I think. Most of the indigenous defense programs are driven by industrial-based management, by threat-driven. So if you look at aircraft such as the P-1, it's a totally indigenous airplane. Which means that it's very, very expensive. It's essentially a handmade airplane with expensive Japanese components. Now, that's fine if Japan wants to go out and develop an airplane, but they're going to be able to build one for $3 if they were going to buy P-8s off the line from Boeing. If they want to buy Apache helicopters and they want to pay to have them reassembled in Japan, it's going to cost them 2 or 3 times what it would cost to buy it off the line. So this idea of creating jobs of industrial-based production means that you get lesser quality goods that are not in demand. The C-2 and the P-1 are going to have a very difficult time being sold anywhere outside Japan. Prime Minister Abe has taken on the role of defense market BD, and he is the best business development person in Japan right now. We saw that he took a personal interest with Prime Minister Abbott in Australia, and he personally tried to push the Soryu through, unfortunately unsuccessfully when Mr. Abbott lost his job, but he did a great effort with the trying to move Soryu into Australia. You've seen that he's also taken the personal initiative within India and trying to move the US-2, even though there's no Indian requirement for the US-2. They've come a long way, and they may yet actually sell US-2. So it's not a good sign when your best BD guy is your prime minister. He has other jobs. He has other responsibilities. It's time for Japanese industry to take up the mantle. On the cyber side, we see balkanized authorities for cybersecurity. This exists in any bureaucracy. It exists in any government. And the Japanese industry and Japanese government have not had the shocks to the system, I'd say, that the U.S. government has had, that has forced the U.S. government into breaking down those stovepipes and beginning to do cross-departmental, cross-agency sorts of cybersecurity requirements. There's also a lack of funding for government of Japan cybersecurity. There was a cyber defense command. They threw 100 people at it, but in terms of general cyber development on the defense side, it's woefully underfunded. I want to give one example on the Olympics. I talked to the head of the previous head of the Japanese 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. And I said, so you have responsibility for cybersecurity? And he said, I sure do. And I said, do you have any money for that? He goes, I don't. I said, do you have any authority to force that? He said, I don't. We had some folks that were sponsored by, I won't say who, but a large government entity within Japan to look at transportation cybersecurity. And so, because my firm does a lot of cyber practice, they came to us and talked to us about what we thought in terms of cybersecurity for transportation. And we had a great discussion, and we said, so what's your timeline? And they said, well, we're under contract, and so that contract, we have to work up until that contract ends. And I said, well, when does that end? They said 3 months prior to the Olympics. So I said, you're going to just do a 2-year study, and 3 months prior to the Olympics, you're going to drop on your sponsors, here are all the things that we need to fix. So it's that sense of urgency. It's the idea that this truly is a national threat that needs to be taken just as seriously as a threat to the Senkakus, is something on the cyber side that I don't think Japan's come to grips with yet. To Norm's point, I think he was making a good point here. There's no NISPOM in Japan. I will submit that I think that's the biggest detriment right now to U.S.-Japan defense relations is the lack of a NISPOM. There's a low U.S. government and industry confidence in Japan's ability on the industrial side to protect intellectual property. Only now is Japan, as some very highly classified programs like the F-35 begin to make their way into the Japanese hopper, they're just now coming to grips with both cyber and industrial protocols. But these are still limited to programs with U.S. involvement. So F-35, SM-3 Block 2A development, places where you have to get security clearances to work on this kind of U.S. equipment. So right now it's a very painful process where it's on a by-name basis having to clear people into a program. This is no way to run a railroad, and we've got to fix this if we want to improve the U.S.-Japan defense-industrial relationship. I think there's also a problem on the cyber side with an inability to address liability. And this idea of an inability to address the legal liabilities of cybersecurity and cyber protection is really holding back Japanese readiness, not just military readiness, but readiness for intelligence sharing, and for disaster response. And in a place like Japan, which is in many ways a disaster supermarket, fixing those kinds of things are important to the people of Japan. Okay, let me go on to some of the industrial co-development challenges. Again, we'll talk a little bit about problems, then I'll offer some solutions here in the next 2 slides. So co-development and co-production are obviously, as we've talked about today, are challenging activities in Japan. Successful co-development and co-production requires sharing of intellectual property and manufacturing capabilities. That's a given. That's just stating the obvious. And success of these initiatives will depend on technology levels offered by Japanese companies, the strength of the Japanese industrial security program, and technology transfer that's approved by the U.S. Right now, U.S. industry has little direct incentive. I mean, people have been hinting around it today, but if you are a large U.S. prime and your Japanese counterparts are coming to you and saying, we want to share, there's really not much other than money to incentivize them. And so I constantly talk to my Japanese friends. They say, wow, we went to talk to Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop and we wanted to do this and they didn't really want to do that. Well, there are reasons for that. There's really no incentive until Japan can begin to share protect, and cooperate in ways that ensure both industrial security for the intellectual property, for security of sensitive intelligence on the U.S. side, those incentives will not get any better than they are today. I can also tell you that my U.S. clients are very concerned about intellectual property in co-development and co-production activities. Most of this is a hangover from countries on the other side of to the west of Japan, so we say, where intellectual property is not valued, and intellectual property theft, even from supposed allies, is quite common. Third-party transfers, anti-tampering, and end-use monitoring need particular attention. These are, in many ways, these are issues that the Japanese government is just now coming to grips with. So I'm not being critical here, because this is a whole new world, and there's so much that Japan has to catch up to so quickly. So these are challenges. They're out there, and there's a role for the U.S. government to play. Third-party transfers, especially for ITAR and CCL items, will be challenging in a co-development and co-production environment. Internal Japanese bureaucracy disagreements on end-use monitoring leads continue to be problematic. The disconnects between the MFA, between METI, between the MOD, and between anybody else that has a say in something that gets shipped overseas or has a relationship overseas continue to lack a coordination, an internal coordination mechanism. Now, I know the NSS, I visited the NSS last week, and I know that they know that there are some shortcomings here, but there's got to be a more of a set process here so that Japanese industry doesn't get stymied at the first turn. Japanese anti-tamper, we had a chance to talk to our friends from METI about 6 months ago, and this is something obviously that's just now becoming important to Japan, or as important to Japan as it is to the United States, and that is making sure that you know where your technology goes when it goes to a third party, what happens to it, who's using it for what purposes, and making sure that it doesn't go anywhere that you don't want it to go, and if it does, that you're able to make sure that it's somehow voided and won't be used in pernicious ways, or ways that are contrary to your own national interests. My U.S. colleagues tell me that oftentimes their Japanese partners want technology released on co-development and co-production items before they know what they actually want to do. So it's give us your stuff, and then we'll talk about what we want to do. So probably not the right approach, but it's a challenge for the U.S. or for Japanese industry in meeting the technology security and licensing requirements. There are also stovepipe impediments to information sharing in both the government and the private sector in both the U.S. and Japan. A friend of mine who was in a recent conference in Japan, especially on the cybersecurity side, said they came away from that conference saying this is the single biggest problem is the stovepiping and the impediments to information sharing between U.S. industry, U.S. government, Japanese industry, and Japanese government. This is a bit off topic, but it's something that always needs to be in the back of people's minds, and that is that licensed production is pernicious to any aspiration to create a competitive, globally competitive defense industrial base. Licensed production is Stalin would approve. It is not capitalist. It does not inject capitalist discipline into the defense base. And until that discipline and that competitive spirit comes into the Japanese defense base, it'll be very tough to make globally competitive products. Excuse me. Okay, here are some prescriptions on how do we fix some of these problems. First thing is industrial security and protection of IP must be key pillars of the future of the U.S.-Japan defense relationship. This includes both Japanese government, Japanese industry, and academia. For those of you who are more expert in things Japan than I'm told that in academia there's still quite a strain of pacifism that is resistant to, shall we say, the same sorts of research and development activities that many U.S. institutions would undertake. And so in some ways the Japanese industry is losing out on the academic and the research-based kinds of capabilities that the U.S. has. At some point it'll be important to pull that back in, but being able to have security and protection of IP within those academic institutions will be important as well. Classification levels. Japan obviously needs the ability to do classification and do personnel clearance. Right now, as I said, it's being done, my understanding, on the F-35 program on a person-by-person, case-by-case basis. And so there's got to be something put in place, something like what the U.S. or any of the Five Eyes countries have in terms of security clearance and personnel reliability maintenance. Aggressive cybersecurity and cyber training is just a given. Defense is in this case is the best offense, and there are industry concerns. I think in the U.S. the government of Japan does not take cyber training seriously enough to protect proprietary information or statistics, and I think what we need here is a NISPOM with Japanese characteristics, and I'll talk a little bit here what that might look like and who should help. I think the government of Japan must be encouraged to take a full advantage of the 3 Ps relaxation. It's only been around for a year and a half, 2 years now, and so it's quite understandable that there would be problems in getting it off the ground. Again, so my criticisms here are very mild because I understand how difficult this is. In some ways, Japanese industry is hesitant to embrace the freedoms that it's been granted, and that goes back to talking about incentivization. They aren't incentivized to do it at 4% to 6% profit margins and the inability to export. I call it the virtuous circle. When you begin to export defense articles into various markets, you're going to look at somewhere between 2 and 10x profit margins of what you would be making with your sovereign government. So the only way to begin to develop globally competitive defense articles is to plow those profits back into your IRAD, into your internal R&D cycle, and begin to develop the next best thing. Now, the good part is that next best thing also goes to the defense of Japan, but it also allows you to stay globally competitive. You look at some of the countries around the world, such as Israel, you look at Singapore, you look at Norway, Sweden. These are all countries that have used exports to generate their own capabilities and to create a very robust and globally competitive defense capability. Japanese industry still relies heavily on the government of Japan to advocate for its industry. Until there's true business development and there's true desire by various Japanese companies to branch out into the wild world of competitive defense sales, that's not going to change. I actually had a Japanese company I was talking to. They said, yeah, we want to come to the U.S. and we want to sell into this market, but we don't want any competitors. And I thought they were kidding. I looked at them and I went, huh, and then I went, oh, you're not laughing. And okay, sorry, it doesn't work that way. So because of this and because of the challenges that Japan industry has, I think that initially that the government of Japan and the government of the U.S. need to take the lead on industry-to-industry collaboration. We're seeing that, but they also need to do things like they need to share risk. The Japanese government can do this in various ways. They can help with some of the R&D through various research organizations. They can do things like funding. There are all sorts of funding mechanisms that can help reduce the risk because this is a big change for Japanese industry, and they do need some help. The government of Japan, I think, must reconcile the Japanese foreign policy objectives with third-party transfer and end-use monitoring requirements. I will give you a true example, and I won't tell you the Japanese bureaucracy that I talked to. I had a Japanese client that was asked to approach a Middle East country and to see if they could sell into that Middle East country. So we went and we talked to this Japanese bureaucracy, and they said good to go. And 2 months later, we went back and said, okay, we're ready to go. And they said, no, now you can't do it. And we said, why? And they said, because Denmark put a sanction on this company in the European Union. And we said, and how does that apply to Japan? And so the difficulty of a Japanese industry committing to a particular course of action or a long lead term development of a particular capability needs to have some of that risk, some of that foreign policy risk removed from the equation. Okay, let's talk about cybersecurity. How do we improve cybersecurity to improve the relationship? I will say, personal opinion, the single biggest impediment to the future of U.S.-Japan security relationship is Japan's lack of an overarching industrial and cybersecurity protocols. Whether this is industrial cooperation or intelligence sharing, Japan must create the sort of confidence-building measures that the U.S. will appreciate and begin to open up some of the IP, some of the classified capabilities, and most importantly, intelligence sharing. If Japan ever has an aspiration to be the sixth eye, this is the first step. Cybersecurity confidence building measures. Here are some things that from a recent U.S.-Japan cybersecurity conference where they talked about, here are some things that Japan could do. Strong authentication across the board, industry and defense. Device hardening, reducing attack surfaces. That's cyber speak for fewer points of entry, of fewer vulnerabilities within the ecosystem of your organization. Alignment of cybersecurity and computer network defense providers. So part of this goes to the inability to have that discussion between industry and government to talk about threats in near real time in ways that they can be dealt with by both sides of the equation. I do know that Japan has done a good job in that they have appointed a new director of cyber policy. I think the problem is that person is in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As you know, the NISPOM in the U.S. is cross-cutting, CIA, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, Commerce. Everybody has a seat at the table. So if you're going to do a NISPOM with Japanese characteristics, it has to be interagencies. The authorities have to be clear, and there has to be somebody who has the hammer to enforce the policies that are implemented by the government itself. Legal frameworks and other procedures and regulations should incentivize secure sharing and collaboration. Recognizing that, I say this to my Japan friends, it sounds like I'm beating you up, but I'm not. The U.S. has learned these lessons over and over the hard way. You look at most of the Chinese technology that's coming out today, the J20, the J31, you look at the PL15, and you can point to the server that it was stolen from in the United States. So this is no longer just a U.S. problem. This is a U.S.-Japan alliance problem because we face the same threat in the Pacific. So learn from us. Learn from the painful lessons that we have, and it's a lot easier and it's a lot cheaper. Operational technology and weapon systems, mission systems, platforms, and IT have interactive vulnerabilities that must be addressed together, focusing on mission assurance. I think Jim Armington talked about this earlier, this idea of the Internet of Things. Well, Internet of Things ought to scare the heck out of you because so much of it is cyber insecure. If we're going to do this, most people think that this is the future in C4ISR, and if we're going to do joint C4ISR, if we're going to protect the commons of the Nansei Shoto and the East China Sea, and all of the southern approaches, if we are going to do that together, then it's going to take a lot of piece parts that will look like the Internet of Things, and being able to make all of that cyber secure across two countries, two militaries, and two civilian authorities is a real challenge. But if you don't, I guarantee you that whoever the adversary may be, let's say China, they will find a way in, and we will find out the hard way once the shooting starts. It's a platitude, I know, but both governments need to share information more quickly and do it. It's there. We just need to do it. Hardened government and industry workforce, it's not just the cyber specialists, it's the first and last line is defense, and it's the weakest link. Everybody down, it's not all your sysadmins, it's not your Edward Snowdens, it's the people, it's your secretaries, it's your low-level workers, it's everybody up to the president of companies, and it requires a cultural change. It's requiring now a cultural change in U.S. defense industry. We're quite a ways along. It's going to require that same sort of cultural change and the leadership that's concomitant with that change in Japan as well. On the cyber side, prioritizing defense, looking for opportunities such as the multilateral info sharing agreement, so that these misses can be done in multilateral ways that are all part of the U.S. CERT. So I just wanted to give you an example of one way that this can all be shared. So before I lose my voice here, let me just come up with a couple of final thoughts. I think that the industrial intelligence future relationship between the U.S. and Japan will rest on Japanese initiative. Right now, the incentive to do so is not as strong as it should be within the United States, and this is Japan's future. It's the U.S.-Japan alliance, but the incentives need to be created, and the effort needs to come from Japan first. Both U.S. and Japan industry has to be incentivized by their governments with shared risk and joint programs. We're just going to, we're getting out of, going to get Japanese industry out of this managed economy and into the competitive, globally competitive defense market. We need to help them along and do some things that will incentivize their CEOs to spend that next yen on something that would be in the defense of Japan and not in some gold mine in Mongolia. And finally, I think that a Japanese NISPOM is the best first step. There's roles here. I've heard from my Japanese friends that they get, DISA comes in over here, and AT&L comes over here, and OSD policy comes in over here, and they don't get a coherent, tell us what you should do. We're getting all these different, it's complex, it's difficult. I think that U.S. industry sees the opportunity of a very technologically sophisticated society in Japan. It's probably going to be our most important ally going forward in the Pacific. I think that industry has a role here, has an incentive if they look beyond the next quarter in terms of profit to begin to help Japanese industry put those foundational blocks in place that will allow Japan to be a better partner, to be a trusted partner, and to be able to share at the highest levels of classification and industry. Thank you very much.
I'm going to make you not rest your voice quite yet, Steve, because I have a first question for you, and then I'm going to turn to my question for Norman. No one is going to accuse you of having looked at the future of U.S.-Japan defense technology cooperation through rose-colored glasses. And perhaps given the kind of sort of optimistic discussions that we've been having this morning and this afternoon, and the assumptions that some of those optimism rests on, some might say that parts of your talk represent a kind of dash of cold water on some of them.
Tough love.
Tough love. I like that. But here's my question for you to think about, and that is, you've got on the one hand, you've got let's say, a corporate culture in Japanese defense industry, which is highly anti-competitive because of the nature in which that industry has been built over the decades. On the other hand, you also have a defense industry which leaks like a sieve. It has all kinds of industrial security problems, from cyber all the way through to intellectual property and transfer of technology issues, etc. Which comes first? In other words, is it the case that the Japanese government could enforce, let's say, the institutions that shape a industrial security regime that would then make Japanese industry more competitive, starting in the United States? They would then encourage and incentivize a more competitive outlook and to sort of see and grow out the possibilities for defense export trade and all that can follow from a really robust defense trade regime? Or is it the case that what you really need to do is a shakeup at the top to bring in people who are maybe executives brought in from the commercial divisions of some of these companies like Toshiba, Hitachi, and or people from Toyota, and then what they'll realize is if we're going to be competitive in this, we're going to have to adopt much more stringent cybersecurity rules. We're going to have to look much more closely at building a kind of interagency effort in terms of industrial security. Which direction would pay off the most in the future?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think the bad news is that the Chinese are belligerent and the Chinese are threatening world peace around the world. But that's also the good news too. I was at PACOM last week, and then had a couple days in Tokyo talking about integrated air and missile defense. The Chinese threat will continue to grow. It's not going to go away. They will become more belligerent. I think that there's a military clash of some kind going to happen somewhere. It would probably be most like the Chinese and not take on the U.S. directly, but rather take on one of the smaller countries in the region. So I think that the Japanese government was quite shaken up by the flying the H-6 bombers around Taiwan, showing how vulnerable the southern approaches have become. I think that Mr. Duterte has also shaken up both the U.S. and the Japanese, showing the increased vulnerability of the southern reaches. So the Chinese threat, in a way, is going to be a forcing function for the Japanese government to begin to take some of these challenges a bit more seriously and exert a bit more leadership. Again, I am a friend of Japan, and when I do say these things, I say them tough love. And so when I'm over there, when I'm talking to Japanese industry and Japanese government, I think they are coming to the realization that there needs to be somebody who will step up and exert the leadership within the government. Now, whether that comes from the NSS, whether it comes from some sort of a legislative Goldwater Nichols, their joint staff is still just now getting the say it should with the Prime Minister, the ability for the joint staff or for the NSS to actually direct kinds of capabilities that are truly joint and in the best interest. I don't think something. It's not Japanese to come in and fire a bunch of people or bring in a bunch of movers and shakers. So I'm not going to butt heads with the cultural proclivities. But I do think that there's an opportunity here as the Chinese threat grows for the Japanese government, and this is everybody. This is MFA, this Ministry of Finance. It's our friends at METI, and our friends at MOD, and at ATLA. I would suggest that there's still no defense industrial policy. What is the defense industrial policy of Japan? Just begin to put it out there and help industry think about that. What is it? Is it nanotechnology? Is it AI? Is it machine learning? Is it cyber? What is it that Japan wants to see its industries develop? And then begin to focus on that, to come in and to be able to say, okay, if you work on this, we'll subsidize it this way, or we'll go to the United States. I mean, I know that Kuroi-san is over here quite often to talk to Bob Work about where can Japan play into that third offset policy. Everybody's excited about third offset policy, but finding a place and a way to plug in is going to require real leadership on the Japanese side, because these are places that Japanese industry is not, it's not going to be the first place, or it's not the first phone call that a Lockheed or a Boeing is going to make saying, hey, who's going to be our best partner on this? So there's a big role the Japanese government can play, and it's going to be much more subtle. It doesn't mean throwing a supplemental of $2 or $3 billion at IAMD. It's going to be leadership, it's going to be institutional changes, and it's going to be cultural changes.
I tell you what, I'm going to throw questions to the audience from here, to the gentleman in there.
My name is Sam Miranda. I don't have an affiliation. I'm retired from the NRC, and I have a little anecdote concerning intellectual property. Then I have a question. I used to work for Westinghouse, and I was a project engineer for a joint development program with Mitsubishi to develop an advanced reactor for Japanese utilities. And one day we got a report from Japan that Mitsubishi had filed a patent application for a design that was a part of the reactor vessel that Westinghouse had developed. And one of my responsibilities was to track that down, and I managed to get a hand-drawn sketch from one of the technology transfer meetings and sent that off to Japan and got that application withdrawn. But the question I have is, as a longtime engineer in the nuclear power industry, I was doing analyses of accidents and accident responses in nuclear plants, and there we had a very well-defined concept of risk, which was basically the probability of an accident times its consequences. And you talked about, Mr. Pershonian, you talked about risk-based analysis and mitigation, and the same terms are used at the NRC. But I would like to know how that translates to security and how it translates to vulnerabilities. Is there some kind of a database of vulnerabilities and the probabilities of these vulnerabilities existing? and the consequences? And do you draw on that and to do these risk-based analyses?
Sure. Well, the Defense Security Service actually has a counterintelligence arm, and they've been in business since started in 1993. They had some detailees from the various military departments, and then it morphed into a fairly robust CI capability. So they have individuals on staff that have the capabilities to identify. The first step, of course, is to take a look at the company's technologies. What are their crown jewels? And then, based on that discussion, then the Defense Security Service then will evaluate what the threats would be, what the vulnerabilities are, and actually develop some countermeasures as well, but based on their connections through the CI community as well.
That reminds me, the question I was going to ask you, Norman, just to pull back for a second. Much of our discussion here about industrial security is focused on cyber and cybersecurity, but that's by no means the entire package, is it, when you're thinking about industrial security for defense firms and situations?
That's correct, because there are many categories or subcategories within industrial security. There's personnel security clearances, there's physical protection of classified information, there's destruction of classified information, reproduction of classified information, processing of classified information on computer systems. There's a whole gamut of subcategories and many regulations that have to be followed.
Advisor to UNESCO, member of the task force, I take the liberty to ask you a totally different question, yet related to security. The last 6 months, very obvious needs to rebuild communities where cultural heritage and natural heritage has been destroyed, Syria and all over the world. At the same time, in developed countries like United States, 5.5 million youths from 16 to 24 years old, out of school, out of job, and has been declared a national security issue. In Japan, what is called hikikomori effect, 1.5 million, the same second generation is already there. My question is the following. Beyond technologies, and I'm convinced it can be done, but would Japan and United States join forces and engage in restoring, rebuilding communities from Syria to Africa, including in USA and Japan as such? There are many technologies. I evaluated those technologies. America has a lot of knowledge, a lot of competence, many technologies. Japan has much experience, unique in the world, to rebuild Japan, what is called cool Japan, whatever. I was involved quite a few years. So, as probably creating better conditions for hardcore technology, high tech and so on, would Japan consider with United States as a national security issue, not only in Japan, but all over the world, by working together in joint projects to rebuild communities? When somebody visited last week Syria, Iraq, and so on, Jordan, Turkey, without rebuilding those communities in terms of jobs, education, multicultural communities, whatever technologies you offer will fail all of us. And if you go along the Silk Road, Silk Road, whatever China is developing, there's a huge need to rebuild communities, environment, energy, culture, helping them work together. So, to me, it's a security issue. Japan and America have unique potential and capabilities to do that. I would appreciate if you cannot, I apologize. I was confronted to problems of cooperation U.S.-Japan. I used to be advisor to one of the president of a major European country. But how would you address this today?
Steve, you want to have a shot at that one?
It's a little bit off topic, but I would tell you that Japan spends a lot of money on trying to rebuild communities around the world. Japan is not as appreciated as it should be for the humanitarian efforts that it makes around the world. And that's unfortunate because they are one of the largest donors in the world to things like humanitarian relief and disaster response, and in preserving cultures around the world. And I think some of this is, I won't get terribly political about it, but let's just say that I don't think Japan is properly appreciated for the role it plays around the world in that sense.
Right. I think also one of the points that you touch on with your question, and you were comparing this to the One Belt, One Road strategy that China has undertaken, is that China does think about its humanitarian missions in strategic terms, yes. As well as in quote, humanitarian terms, or in terms of, burnishing its public image around the world. Right. And I think there could be an opportunity from that standpoint in which Japan's defense export business can piggyback on a infrastructure export industrial strategy in which the two connect together, because part of rebuilding communities obviously is not just physical infrastructure but also making them secure against hostile neighbors or internal threats and a range of other kinds of things as well.
I think Prime Minister Abe has made great efforts recently to do this in Africa. So part of this is chasing China into Africa, but I also think that there's ameliorism and a quality of spirit of wanting to help that Japan isn't well recognized.
And which could also work in this country too, by the way, for in terms of infrastructure projects. Question.
Steve, I want to thank you for the statement that you made. I don't hear that very often enough. Being here in this country, they are trying to be nice to Japanese, but I think
I am too. I promise you. So
yeah. But the real friendship is the one where you can criticize each other, trying to get it better.
Yes.
That's a real sign of a real friendship. But the things you said, probably you won't be able to understand Japan unless you live there for a few years.
Right.
Because it has a lot to do with the DNA, and then, you're going to get that thing going.
Yes.
In my opinion, I'm a Japan native U.S. citizen since 1986. Mm-hmm. I've been here about 45 years. What I'm trying to say is, in my opinion, Japan has made a great leap. Mm-hmm. 70 years ago, 71 years ago, they went flat on their face, mm-hmm. as you know. Since then, they have made remarkable achievements that I respect, mm-hmm. and I'm proud of that. Mm-hmm. But I have right to criticize Japan because Japan is my mother country. But anyway, Japanese are not innovators for reasons. They are good at within the system, mm-hmm. living under that system. They're good, but if you are a nail sticking up in the air, that's not Japanese people.
Right.
They're obedient. Right. They're so you cannot expect Donald Trump like people there in Japan. That's my point.
Yes.
So, but anyway.
I
just wanted to say thank you for
that. Okay, we've got time for one more question to the back.
FNC with the United States of Africa 2017 project, and I usually would not make any comment, but since Africa was mentioned about the Japanese incursion into Africa now, we want to suggest this. Any attempt by any sector, Japan, China, whatever, or United States into Africa, which is to prop up the current government in Africa, this project will consider it a hostile act, and it will take political action to redress it. So in other words, Japanese coming to Africa should come with a different mindset than what has been going on the last 60 years.
Well, here we've wound up with another stricture with regard to global policy, both for
Mr.
Japan
Mugabe
and
enjoyed his visit to Tokyo recently, so.
He did. That's true. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our final panelists one more time for a really fascinating and in some ways bracing conversation and discussion.
Totally.
And I want to thank you, our audience, for your attendance here and for your patience, for your many very interesting, illuminating questions. I also do want to take last few minutes to thank two of our sponsors, Smith Richardson Foundation, as well as White and Case, for their generous support for making this conference possible. And I also want to say that we'll look forward to seeing you at more events in which we'll be able to explore the development of this U.S.-Japan defense technology, defense trade cooperation going forward. And I look forward to seeing you there next time. Thank you.